The mud splattered across Delilah Vaughn's torn skirts as she stumbled through the darkness, her lungs burning with each ragged breath, while the sound of hoofbeats thundered somewhere behind her in the Montana night. She had been running for 3 days straight, ever since she witnessed what she should never have seen in that smoke-filled back room at the Silver Dollar Saloon in Helena. Ever since she heard the territorial judge himself order the murder of a witness who dared speak against the mining consortium that controlled half the territory. They wanted her silent, permanently, and she knew with absolute certainty that speaking one word about what she knew would mean a bullet in her back or a knife across her throat in some dark alley. The September air of 1883 carried the first hints of the coming winter as Delilah crashed through the underbrush along the creek bed, her dark hair hanging in tangled ropes around her face, her green eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. She had been a bookkeeper for the consortium, a position she had earned through her skill with numbers and her ability to keep her head down and her mouth shut. 23 years old and orphaned since she was 16, she had learned early that survival meant invisibility. That safety came from being overlooked and unremarkable. But 3 nights ago, she had stayed late to finish the quarterly accounts, and she had heard everything through the thin walls of the office adjacent to that private room. Judge Harrington's voice had been clear as crystal. The witness has to disappear before the trial next week. I do not care how you accomplish it, but it must look like an accident. We have too much invested in those mineral rights to let some crusading fool destroy everything. She had frozen at her desk, her pen hovering above the ledger, ice flooding through her veins as she recognized the other voices in the room. Marcus Blackwell, the consortium's enforcer. Samuel Crane, the territorial marshal who was supposed to uphold the law. And worst of all, her own employer, Richard Thornton, whose signature she had forged on documents for years at his own instruction, making her complicit in schemes she had tried desperately not to understand. Delilah had fled that very night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and the small amount of money she kept hidden in her room. She knew the reach of these men extended throughout the territory, knew that the law itself was in their pocket. Speaking out would accomplish nothing except her own death. Her only hope was to run far enough and fast enough that they would decide she was not worth the trouble of hunting down. But she had underestimated their paranoia and their resources. By the second day, she had spotted the riders on her trail, 4 men who moved with the purposeful determination of professional hunters. They were not trying to catch her immediately, she realized with growing horror. They were wearing her down, driving her further from civilization, further from any possible help or witness. Now, as she stumbled through the darkness somewhere north of Helena, she had no idea where she was going. The small town of Hecla lay somewhere ahead, or so the last signpost had indicated, but she had left the main road hours ago when she spotted her pursuers closing the distance. The wilderness of Montana stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the pale light of a waning moon. Her foot caught on a root, and she went down hard, her hands slamming into the rocky ground. Pain shot through her wrists, and she bit back a cry, forcing herself to stay silent even as tears of frustration and exhaustion streamed down her face. She could hear the horses now, closer than before, and voices calling back and forth in the darkness. She cannot have gone far. The tracks lead right through here. When we find her, make it quick. The boss wants this cleaned up tonight. Delilah pushed herself to her feet, swaying with dizziness. Her vision swam, and she realized she had not eaten in nearly 2 days, had barely slept in 3. She would not be able to run much longer. The realization brought a strange calm over her fear. If this was how it ended, at least she would not go quietly. At least she would try to survive until her last breath. She forced her legs to move, stumbling forward along the creek bank, and that was when she saw it. A light, small and golden, flickering through the trees perhaps a quarter-mile ahead. A cabin or a campfire or something that meant another human being. The hunters behind her were close enough now that she could hear their horses splashing through the shallow water, and she knew she had only minutes before they would be upon her. Delilah ran toward that light with everything she had left, her breath coming in sobs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The trees opened into a clearing, and she saw a small ranch house, weathered but well-maintained, with smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows. A barn stood off to one side, and a corral held several horses who raised their heads curiously at her crashing approach. She did not make it to the porch. Her legs finally gave out and she fell to her knees in the dirt of the yard, her vision going dark at the edges. Behind her, she heard the horses burst from the tree line, heard the men shouting in triumph. The door of the ranch house flew open, and a man stepped out onto the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, with a rifle in his hands. Delilah tried to speak, to beg for help, but no sound came from her throat. She watched as if from a great distance as the man took in the scene with one sweeping glance, his eyes moving from her collapsed form to the 4 riders who were pulling their horses to a halt at the edge of his property. "That is far enough," the man said, and his voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "You are on my land and that woman is under my protection." The lead rider, a man with a scarred face that Delilah recognized even in her fading consciousness as Marcus Blackwell himself, leaned forward in his saddle. "That woman is a thief and a liar. She stole from her employer and we have been hired to bring her back to face justice." "Then you can come back with a proper warrant and a proper lawman," the man on the porch said. His rifle had not moved, still held in a casual but ready position across his chest. "Right now, all I see is 4 armed men chasing a terrified woman onto my property in the middle of the night. I do not take kindly to that." "This is none of your concern, friend," Blackwell said, his voice hardening. "Hand her over and we will be on our way." "No," the single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Delilah watched through blurring vision as the cowboy took 2 steps forward to the edge of the porch, and she could see him more clearly now in the light spilling from the house. He looked to be in his late 20s, with dark hair and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. His eyes were the blue-gray of storm clouds, and they held no fear at all as he faced down 4 armed men. "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said. "This is my land, legally purchased and registered with the territorial government. That woman collapsed on my property, and by the law of this territory, she is entitled to my hospitality and protection until such time as proper legal authority with proper documentation requests otherwise. Now, I suggest you gentlemen turn those horses around and head back the way you came." "You are making a serious mistake," Blackwell said, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. Thomas Garrett's rifle came up so smoothly, it seemed like a continuation of his previous stillness rather than a separate motion. "The only mistake being made here is you threatening me on my own land. I have 4 bullets in this rifle and 4 targets. At this range, I will not miss. Your choice is to ride away now or to try your luck and see how many of you die before you manage to kill me. And I promise you, even if you get me, you will not all survive it." For a long moment, the tableau held. Delilah felt consciousness slipping away from her like water through cupped hands, but she fought to stay aware, to see how this would end. Her fate, her very life, hung in the balance of this stranger's courage against impossible odds. Blackwell's face twisted with fury, but he was not a stupid man. He had seen the way Thomas held that rifle, the absolute certainty in his stance. This was not a man who made idle threats. "This is not over," he said finally. "We will be back, and we will have what we came for." "You are welcome to try," Thomas said. "During daylight hours, through legal channels with proper authority. Anything else and you will be trespassing on my land, which gives me the legal right to defend my property with lethal force. I suggest you remember that." The four riders wheeled their horses around. Blackwell, shooting one last venomous look at the woman, collapsed in the dirt before spurring his mount back toward the trees. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, and then there was only silence except for Delilah's ragged breathing and the distant call of a night bird. Thomas Garrett lowered his rifle and crossed the yard in 3 long strides, dropping to one knee beside her. "You are safe now," he said, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. "They are gone. You are safe." Delilah tried to speak, to thank him, to warn him about the danger he had just brought upon himself, but the darkness finally claimed her and she knew nothing more. She woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic seized her chest until memory came flooding back. The chase, the clearing, the cowboy with the rifle standing between her and certain death. Delilah sat up slowly, discovering she was lying in a real bed with clean sheets and a thick quilt. Someone had removed her torn and muddy dress and replaced it with a man's shirt that hung nearly to her knees. Her hair had been brushed and braided, and her hands and face had been washed clean. A basin of water sat on a small table beside the bed, along with a neatly folded dress that looked like it might actually fit her. The door opened, and a woman perhaps 10 years older than Delilah entered, carrying a tray with food and coffee. She had kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Oh good, you are awake," the woman said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "You gave us quite a scare, sleeping for nearly 14 hours straight. I am Martha Garrett, Thomas's older sister. I live about 5 miles east, but he sent for me last night after those men left. He thought you might be more comfortable with another woman here when you woke up." "Thank you," Delilah managed, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "Thank you for everything. I do not know what I would have done if—" "Drink some water first," Martha said kindly, handing her a glass. "Then we can talk. You are safe here, truly. My brother may look like just another rancher, but he is stubborn as a mule when it comes to doing what is right. Those men will not get past him." Delilah drank gratefully, the cool water soothing her raw throat. "He does not understand what he is up against. Those men, they are not just hired thugs. They work for powerful people who do not accept defeat." "Then you can tell us all about it over breakfast," Martha said. "Get dressed and come out when you are ready. Thomas is in the kitchen making enough food to feed an army as usual." The dress fit reasonably well, if a little loose in the waist. Delilah braided her hair as best she could and emerged from the bedroom to find herself in a surprisingly comfortable ranch house. The main room was large and open, with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was scrupulously clean and organized. Thomas Garrett stood at the stove, flipping bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He had shaved since the night before, and in the morning light, Delilah could see him more clearly. He was indeed handsome in a rugged, practical way, with strong features and those remarkable storm-gray eyes. He looked up as she entered and offered a slight smile. "Good morning, miss. I realize I never got your name." "Delilah Vaughn," she said quietly. "And I owe you my life, Mr. Garrett." "Thomas, please," he said, gesturing toward the table. "Sit down. You need to eat, and then you need to tell me what kind of trouble you are running from. I meant what I said last night about protecting you, but I should know what I am protecting you from." Over breakfast, with Martha and Thomas listening intently, Delilah told them everything. She started with her position at the consortium, her years of quiet service keeping the books and asking no questions. She described what she had overheard 3 nights ago, the cold certainty in Judge Harrington's voice as he ordered murder as casually as another man might order dinner. She explained her flight, her growing realization that she could never go to the authorities because the authorities themselves were corrupt. "They want me silent," she finished, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it could protect her from the cold reality of her situation. "Not just quiet or cooperative. They want me dead because as long as I am alive, I am a threat to everything they have built. Even if I never speak a word of what I know, they cannot risk that I might change my mind." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Martha reached across the table and squeezed Delilah's hand. "You poor thing," she said. "To carry that kind of fear, that kind of knowledge, all alone." "The witness they were planning to kill," Thomas said. "Who is he?" "A prospector named James Wheeler. He discovered that the consortium has been fraudulently claiming mineral rights on federal land, using forged documents and bribed surveyors. He was supposed to testify at a territorial hearing next week. I do not know if they succeeded in killing him or not. I ran before I could find out." "We need to get word to someone," Martha said. "Surely there must be honest lawmen somewhere in the territory." "And how do we know who is honest and who is not?" Thomas asked quietly. "The territorial marshal himself is involved. Judge Harrington is involved. We do not know how deep this corruption goes or who we can trust." He looked at Delilah, and she saw something fierce and protective in his eyes. "But I meant what I said last night. You are under my protection, and you are welcome to stay here as long as you need to. I have built this ranch with my own hands over the past 5 years, and I will be damned if I let corrupt men turn it into a hunting ground." "You do not understand what you are risking," Delilah said desperately. "These are not men who will give up. They have unlimited resources and the law on their side. They will destroy you just for standing in their way." "Then let them try," Thomas said simply. "I have fought harder battles than this, and I am still here. Besides," and here he offered her a small smile, "someone once told me that the measure of a man is not in what he says but in what he does when it costs him something. This might cost me something, but that does not make it any less right." Over the following days, Delilah began to understand the kind of man Thomas Garrett truly was. He had come to Montana 5 years earlier with almost nothing, a former cavalry scout who had served in various frontier posts and saved every penny of his pay. He had purchased this land, a beautiful stretch of valley with good water and grazing, and built everything on it with his own hands. He ran cattle and bred horses, and had earned a reputation in the surrounding area as an honest dealer and a hard worker. He also, Delilah learned, had a stubborn streak a mile wide when it came to matters of principle. When Blackwell and 2 of his men returned 3 days later with a territorial warrant for Delilah's arrest on charges of theft, Thomas read the document carefully, and then pointed out 3 separate legal irregularities that made it invalid. "This warrant is signed by Judge Harrington," Thomas said calmly, standing on his porch with his rifle once again in easy reach. "But Judge Harrington has no jurisdiction in this county. You would need a warrant from Judge Patterson, who presides over this district. This warrant also fails to specify exactly what was allegedly stolen, which is a legal requirement. And finally, it is dated 2 days before Miss Vaughn allegedly committed this theft, which suggests it was prepared in advance of any actual crime. Blackwell's face had gone purple with rage. "You think you are clever, do you? You think your legal tricks will save you?" "I think the law means something," Thomas replied. "And I think if you had a legitimate case, you would have a legitimate warrant, come back with proper documentation, or do not come back at all." After they left, Delilah had stood on the porch beside Thomas, her heart hammering with fear and something else she could not quite name. "You studied the law," she said. "I grew up with a father who was a frontier judge," Thomas said. He believed that law was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. He made sure all his children understood how it worked, both in spirit and in letter. "I may be just a rancher now, but I remember what he taught me." "They will not stop," Delilah said quietly. "Legal or illegal, they will find a way." Thomas turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw determination and something warmer, something that made her breath catch. "Then we will find a way to stop them first. You are not alone in this anymore, Delilah. You do not have to carry this fear by yourself." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She realized suddenly that she was noticing things about him that had nothing to do with the safety he provided. The way his hands moved with careful precision, whether he was handling a horse or pouring coffee. The quiet strength in his voice when he spoke. The kindness in his eyes when he looked at her. A kindness that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine respect. She pushed the thoughts away, telling herself that gratitude and attraction were being confused in her exhausted mind. Thomas Garrett was her protector, nothing more. He was risking his life out of principle, not out of any personal feeling for her. But as the days turned into weeks, it became harder to maintain that distance. Thomas taught her to ride the horses properly, patiently correcting her seat and showing her how to communicate with the animal through subtle shifts of weight and pressure. He taught her to shoot, setting up targets in a small canyon behind the house and standing behind her as she learned to hold the rifle steady, his hands guiding hers as he explained about breathing and trigger pull. "You are a natural," he said after she hit her 5th target in a row. "You have steady hands and a good eye." "I spent years writing in tiny ledgers," Delilah said. "I suppose that builds hand control." "It is more than that," Thomas said. "You have nerve. Most people flinch when they pull the trigger, but you stay focused through the recoil. That takes real courage." She looked up at him, struck by the genuine admiration in his voice. "I have never felt particularly courageous. Mostly I have felt afraid. Courage is not the absence of fear," Thomas said quietly. "It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You ran 3 days through wilderness with trained hunters after you. You survived. That is courage, Delilah." The way he said her name, with that gentle firmness, made something in her chest tighten. She found herself noticing the small details of him more and more. The way he always made sure she ate enough at meals. The way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her words and thoughts mattered. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her skin flush warm. Martha noticed, of course. One afternoon when she had come to visit and Thomas was out checking the fence lines, she sat with Delilah on the porch and spoke bluntly. "You are falling for him," Martha said. It was not a question. Delilah's first instinct was to deny it, but something in Martha's kind eyes made her honest. "I do not know what I am feeling," she admitted. "How can I tell what is real when I am so dependent on his protection, when my very survival depends on his goodwill?" "Thomas does not protect you out of obligation," Martha said gently. "He does it because he cares about you. I have known my brother his entire life, and I have never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. He is falling for you just as hard as you are falling for him. though he is probably too stubborn and honorable to say anything while you are still in danger." "Even if that is true," Delilah said, "what kind of future could we possibly have? I am a fugitive. I can never go back to any kind of normal life. Those men will never stop hunting me." "Then maybe it is time to stop running and start fighting," Martha said. "Thomas has been writing letters, did you know that? To old army contacts, to judges in other territories, to journalists in San Francisco and Denver. He is building a case, gathering allies. He will not let you spend the rest of your life hiding." The revelation stunned Delilah. She had known Thomas rode into the small town of Hecla twice a week to send and receive telegrams, but she had assumed he was simply managing ranch business. The idea that he was actively working to free her from this nightmare, that he was using his own resources and connections on her behalf, overwhelmed her with emotion she could not quite name. That evening, after Martha had left and they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Delilah gathered her courage. "Martha told me what you have been doing," she said quietly. "The letters, the investigation. Thomas, you have already done so much. You do not need to risk more." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the purple and gold sky. "Do you know why I left the cavalry?" he asked finally. "No." "I watched my commanding officer order a massacre of a peaceful Cheyenne village because he wanted to make his reputation as an Indian fighter. I reported it through proper channels, testified at a military tribunal, and watched as political pressure and convenient lies buried the truth. The officer was promoted. I was mustered out with a letter of recommendation that made it clear I was not welcome to re-enlist." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were shadowed with old pain. "I learned then that sometimes the law fails. Sometimes the people who are supposed to uphold justice are the very ones who corrupt it. But I also learned that doing nothing is the same as being complicit. I could not save those Cheyenne families, but maybe I can help save you. Maybe I can make sure the truth comes out this time." "Why?" Delilah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter so much to you?" Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, and his touch sent tingles up her arm. "Because you matter," he said simply. "Not just as a person in need of protection, but as yourself. You are brave and clever and kind. You survived something that would have broken most people. And somewhere along the way, between teaching you to shoot and listening to you talk about your life and watching you refuse to let fear make you bitter, I started to care about you as more than just someone I was protecting." Delilah's heart was racing. "Thomas, You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know this is not the right time. I know you have bigger things to worry about than my feelings. I just wanted you to know that I am not doing this out of abstract principle. I am doing it because I want you to be free, truly free to live whatever life you choose, even if that life does not include me." "And if I wanted it to include you?" Delilah asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "If somewhere between learning to trust you and watching you risk everything for a stranger, I started to care about you too." Thomas's eyes widened, and then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Then I would say that gives me even more reason to make sure you survive this. Because I want a future with you, Delilah Vaughn, and I will fight heaven and hell to make that possible." He leaned forward slowly, and she met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Delilah felt tears on her cheeks, but they were not tears of fear or despair. They were tears of hope, of possibility, of feeling for the first time in years that she might have a future worth fighting for. Over the next weeks, their relationship deepened even as the danger around them intensified. Thomas received word that James Wheeler, the witness the consortium had wanted dead, was still alive and in hiding. He also learned that a federal marshal named John Stone was investigating the consortium from outside the territory, having received anonymous tips about corruption in the Montana territorial government. Stone has a reputation for being incorruptible, Thomas explained over dinner one night. He has taken down corrupt officials in 3 other territories. If we can get your testimony to him along with Wheeler's, it might be enough to break this whole thing open. How do we contact him without the consortium finding out? Delilah asked. Very carefully, Thomas said. I have been corresponding through a lawyer friend in Denver who is acting as an intermediary. Marshal Stone is supposed to arrive in the territory next month under cover of investigating something else entirely. If we can arrange a meeting somewhere neutral, somewhere the consortium is not watching. The plan came together slowly, carefully, with Martha serving as a courier and Thomas's network of contacts providing information and support. But the consortium was not idle. They began pressuring Thomas in other ways, spreading rumors in Hecla that he was harboring a criminal, that he was involved in some kind of conspiracy against legitimate business interests. Some of his neighbors stopped doing business with him, and he had trouble selling his cattle at the railhead when consortium allies made sure the buyers were warned against dealing with him. Delilah watched with growing guilt as Thomas's livelihood suffered because of her presence. This is my fault, she said one evening as they reviewed the ranch accounts. You are being destroyed because of me. They are destroying themselves, Thomas corrected firmly. Their corruption is their choice, not yours, and this ranch has survived harder times than this. I have enough saved to weather a few months of lost business, and once the truth comes out, people will realize they were on the wrong side. But what if it does not work? What if Marshal Stone cannot do anything, or the corruption goes too high, or... Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she fought down panic. Then we will find another way. I will not let you face this alone. I promise you that. She believed him. More than that, she had come to love him with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his stubborn integrity and his dry humor. She loved the way he treated her as an equal partner, asking her opinion on ranch decisions and listening to her ideas. She loved waking up each morning knowing he was there, that she was safe not just because of his rifle, but because of his commitment to her. Their relationship remained chaste by unspoken agreement. Thomas had set up a second bedroom for himself when Martha returned to her own home, and he never presumed on Delilah's gratitude or vulnerability. But there were kisses stolen on the porch in the evening, hands held across the dinner table, and a growing intimacy that had nothing to do with physical passion, and everything to do with 2 souls recognizing each other. The crisis came in late October, 6 weeks after Delilah had first collapsed in Thomas's yard. Word came through the network that Marshal Stone had arrived in Helena and was ready to meet with witnesses. The meeting was set for a location halfway between Thomas's ranch and the town where Wheeler was hiding, at an abandoned line shack in the hills that had once been part of a mining operation. It is a risk, Thomas acknowledged as they prepared for the journey. The consortium might have gotten word somehow. We might be walking into a trap. We have to try, Delilah said firmly. This is our chance to end this, to bring them down before they destroy more lives. I am tired of running, Thomas. I am tired of hiding. I want to stand up and speak the truth as loud as I possibly can. Thomas looked at her with such pride and love that it made her heart ache. Then let us go make sure you get that chance. They left before dawn, taking 2 horses and traveling by routes that avoided the main roads. Thomas had his rifle and his pistol, and Delilah carried a smaller revolver that he had taught her to use. The autumn air was crisp and cold, with the smell of coming snow on the wind. As they rode through the golden aspens and dark pines, Delilah found herself memorizing every detail. The strength of the horse beneath her, the sight of Thomas riding beside her, straight-backed and alert, the vast Montana sky stretching overhead in shades of pink and gold. If this went wrong, if this was her last day of freedom or even of life, at least she would have these memories. At least she would have known what it felt like to be loved by a good man, to be seen and valued for herself rather than for her silence or her compliance. They reached the line shack just after midday. It was a small, weathered structure that looked like a strong wind might knock it over, sitting in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. 2 horses were already tethered outside, and Thomas approached cautiously, his rifle ready. "Marshal Stone," he called out. "Thomas Garrett and Delilah Vaughn. We are here for the meeting." The door opened and a man stepped out, tall and graying, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Beside him came a thin, nervous-looking man who Delilah guessed must be James Wheeler. "Mr. Garrett, Miss Vaughn, thank you for coming. Let us talk inside where we have more privacy." The line shack was barely furnished, with a rickety table and a few chairs. Marshal Stone wasted no time on pleasantries. "Miss Vaughn, I need you to tell me everything you know about the consortium's activities. Mr. Wheeler has already provided extensive testimony about the fraudulent land claims, but your information about the internal operations and the involvement of territorial officials is crucial." For the next 2 hours, Delilah spoke. She described years of suspicious transactions, of documents she had been told to falsify, of money that moved through complex chains of companies to disguise its source. She recounted every word she remembered from that night in Helena, every name she had heard mentioned. Marshal Stone took careful notes, asking sharp questions that showed he understood exactly how complex and dangerous this conspiracy was. "This is excellent," he said finally. "Combined with Wheeler's testimony and the documentary evidence we have been gathering, this should be enough to bring federal charges against everyone involved, from Judge Harrington down to the lowest enforcer. The territorial government will have to allow federal intervention, and these men will face real justice." "When will this happen?" Thomas asked. "How long before Miss Vaughn is safe?" "I will file the charges as soon as I return to Helena," Marshal Stone said. "Within a week, we should have warrants issued and arrests beginning. Once the arrests are made public, Miss Vaughn will no longer be in danger. There will be no point in silencing her when the information is already part of the federal record." Relief flooded through Delilah so powerfully that she felt dizzy. It was really going to happen. The nightmare was going to end. She would be free. That was when the door crashed open and Marcus Blackwell strode in with 4 armed men behind him. "Very touching," Blackwell said, his gun trained on Marshal Stone. "A very thorough confession, Miss Vaughn. Pity none of it will ever reach a courtroom." Everything happened very fast after that. Thomas's rifle came up, but one of Blackwell's men was faster, firing a shot that splintered the table between them. Marshal Stone dove for his own weapon, but Blackwell's gun swung to cover him. Wheeler let out a strangled cry and pressed himself against the wall. "All of you drop your weapons," Blackwell ordered. "Now, or the marshal dies first." Thomas's eyes met Delilah's for one long moment, and she saw apology and fury and desperate calculation in his gaze. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and set it on the floor. Marshal Stone did the same with his pistol. Delilah reached for the small revolver at her waist, and Thomas gave the tiniest shake of his head. "Not yet. How did you know?" Marshal Stone asked calmly, as if discussing the weather rather than his impending execution. "We have eyes everywhere, Marshal," Blackwell said. "Did you really think your investigation was a secret? We have been watching you since you crossed into the territory. We let you set up this meeting because it was convenient to have all our problems in one place." "You will never get away with this," Thomas said. "Killing a federal marshal will bring the entire government down on you." "Maybe," Blackwell shrugged. "Or maybe the marshal was killed by desperate fugitives when he tried to arrest them. Maybe there was a terrible shootout and everyone died." "Tragic, really, but these things happen in the wild territories." He raised his gun, pointing it directly at Marshal Stone's chest. Delilah saw his finger beginning to tighten on the trigger, and everything in her screamed that this could not happen, that she could not let another person die because of her silence. She pulled her revolver and fired in one smooth motion, exactly as Thomas had taught her. The shot took Blackwell in the shoulder, and he staggered back with a roar of pain and fury. Thomas dove for his rifle as chaos erupted in the small shack, gunfire echoing deafeningly in the confined space. Delilah fired again, forcing one of Blackwell's men to duck, giving Thomas the seconds he needed to get his hands on his weapon. Marshal Stone had his gun back and was returning fire, his shots precise and controlled. Wheeler had disappeared under the table, which was probably the smartest thing anyone could do. The fight was brutal and fast. 2 of Blackwell's men went down in the first exchange of gunfire. Thomas shot another as the man tried to get a clear shot at Delilah. But Blackwell, wounded and enraged, managed to get behind cover, and his remaining man was laying down suppressing fire that kept everyone pinned. "We need to move," Thomas shouted over the gunfire. "Out the back now." There was a small window at the rear of the shack. Marshal Stone went first, diving through head first with an agility that belied his age. Thomas grabbed Delilah and practically threw her through next, then hauled Wheeler up from under the table and shoved him toward the opening. A bullet splintered the window frame as Thomas climbed through, and Delilah's heart stopped as she saw blood blooming on his left arm. But he was moving, his right hand still holding his rifle, and together they ran for the cover of the trees. Behind them, Blackwell was screaming orders. "Do not let them escape. Kill them all." They crashed through the forest, branches whipping at their faces. Marshal Stone led the way with the confidence of a man who had done this before, finding a game trail and following it deeper into the wilderness. Delilah could hear pursuit behind them, but Thomas stopped suddenly, raising his rifle. "Keep going," he said. "I will slow them down." "No," Delilah said fiercely. "We stay together." Thomas looked at her, and despite the desperate circumstances, he smiled. "Together, then." He fired 3 quick shots back along the trail, not trying to hit anyone but forcing their pursuers to take cover. Then they were running again, Marshal Stone calling directions, the sound of pursuit growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the line shack. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, until they reached a steep ravine with a creek at the bottom. Marshal Stone led them down a narrow path, half sliding in the loose scree, and then along the creek bed where their tracks would be harder to follow. Finally, when the light was beginning to fade and Delilah thought her lungs might burst, Marshal Stone called a halt in a small cave formed by an overhanging rock face. "We should be safe here for the moment," he said, breathing hard. "They will have trouble tracking us in the dark, and I know these hills. There is a ranger station about 6 miles west of here. If we can reach it by morning, we can get help." Thomas was examining his wound, which turned out to be a deep graze rather than a bullet lodged in his arm. Delilah used strips torn from her petticoat to bind it, her hands shaking with reaction as the full weight of what had just happened crashed over her. "You saved my life," Marshal Stone said to her. "That was one hell of a shot, Miss Vaughn." "I have a good teacher," Delilah said, looking at Thomas. "We all saved each other," Thomas said quietly. "That is what people do when they care about each other. They spent a cold, uncomfortable night in the cave, taking turns on watch. But when dawn came and they made their cautious way west, they saw smoke rising in the distance, not from a forest fire but from what looked like multiple campfires. Rangers, Marshal Stone said with satisfaction. A whole company of them, unless I miss my guess. I requested federal support before I came into the territory, but they were delayed. Looks like they finally arrived. What followed was almost anticlimactic compared to the desperate flight. The Rangers took them into protective custody and within hours had arrested Blackwell and his surviving men. The wounded had fled during the night, leaving their leader to face justice alone. With federal authority now openly involved, the conspiracy began to unravel rapidly. Judge Harrington tried to flee the territory, but was arrested at the border. The territorial marshal was found dead in his office, apparently by his own hand, with a note confessing his involvement. One by one, the members of the consortium were taken into custody as Marshal Stone's carefully built case, supported by Delilah and Wheeler's testimony, proved impossible to deny or suppress. The trials took months, stretching through the winter and into the spring of 1884. Delilah and Thomas stayed in Helena during that time, in a respectable boarding house with Martha acting as chaperone. Delilah testified 3 times, her voice growing stronger and more confident each time as she spoke the truth she had been running from for so long. Thomas sat in the courtroom every single day, his presence a silent support that gave her courage. And when the final verdict came down, guilty on all counts for every member of the conspiracy, when Judge Harrington was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, and the consortium was ordered dissolved and its assets seized, Delilah felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Freedom. Real, genuine freedom. The freedom to speak, to live without fear, to choose her own future. She chose Thomas. They were married in June of 1884, in a small church in Hecla with Martha and her family in attendance, along with Marshal Stone, who had become a friend, and James Wheeler, who had used his portion of the federal reward money to open an honest assay office. Delilah wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers, and when Thomas took her hands in his and spoke his vows, she saw the same love and commitment in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "I promise to stand beside you," Thomas said, his voice steady and sure. "To protect you when you need protection, to give you space when you need freedom, and to love you every day of my life with everything I have." "I promise to be honest," Delilah said, tears streaming down her face. "To speak my truth and never hide in silence again. To stand beside you through whatever comes, and to love you with all my heart for as long as we both live." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with such tenderness and joy that Delilah felt her heart might overflow. This was what she had run toward without knowing it, that desperate night when she stumbled into his yard. Not just safety, but love. Not just protection, but partnership. They returned to the ranch, to the home Thomas had built, and that would now be theirs together. The consortium's downfall had restored Thomas's reputation and his business, and the ranch prospered over the following years. Delilah proved to have a gift for managing the financial side of the operation, her years of bookkeeping experience finally put to honest use. Together they built something neither could have achieved alone: their first child, a son they named James Thomas Garrett after the witness whose courage had helped bring down the conspiracy, was born in the spring of 1885. Delilah had been terrified during the pregnancy, but Thomas had been there every step of the way, holding her hand through the difficult labor and crying with joy when he held his son for the first time. "He is perfect," Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion, "just like his mother." "I am not perfect," Delilah said, exhausted but happy. "But I am free, and I am loved, and that is better than perfection." 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, named Martha after Thomas's sister who had been such a help in those dark days. And 3 years after that, another son, Samuel, completed their family. The ranch became a gathering place for the community, known as a place where people were judged by their character rather than their past, where second chances were given freely, and honesty was valued above all. Delilah and Thomas built a reputation for fairness and integrity that spread throughout the territory. And when Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Thomas was asked to serve as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. "What do you think?" he asked Delilah as they sat on their porch one evening, watching their children play in the yard. "Should I do it?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you," Delilah said, "but I also think you would be good at it. You understand what the law should be, what it should protect, and what it should prevent. You could help build something good." Thomas served 2 terms in the state legislature, working on laws that protected homesteaders and limited the power of large corporations to corrupt local government. He never forgot what had brought him and Delilah together, never forgot the lessons learned from fighting corruption. And through it all, Delilah was beside him, his partner and his equal, speaking her mind and offering her counsel freely. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Delilah riding up into the hills above the ranch, to a meadow full of wildflowers with a view that stretched for miles. They sat together on a blanket, watching the clouds drift across the Montana sky, and reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "The danger, the fear, everything you went through?" Delilah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret that good people were hurt," she said finally. "I regret that corruption was allowed to flourish for so long. But I do not regret the path that brought me to you. Every moment of fear, every desperate mile I ran, it all led me here. To this place, to this life, to you and our children. How could I regret that?" "I love you," Thomas said, pulling her close. "From that first night when you collapsed in my yard, I think some part of me knew you were going to change my life. I just did not know how wonderful that change would be. You told me I could speak as loud as I wanted," Delilah said, smiling up at him. "And you meant it. Not just about the conspiracy, but about everything. You have never tried to silence me or diminish me. You have let me be fully myself, and that is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "You deserve to be heard," Thomas said simply. "Your voice, your thoughts, your truth." "The world is better when you speak, Delilah. I am better when I listen to you." They kissed there in the meadow, with the Montana wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and the sound of birdsong, 2 people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not perfection, but partnership. Not safety alone, but love that made them both braver and stronger. As the years passed, their love only deepened. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns and personal losses. Martha passed away in 1895, and they mourned her together, remembering her kindness and her wisdom. James Wheeler died in 1898, having lived long enough to see the territory he loved become a state governed by honest laws. Marshall Stone retired to a small cabin not far from their ranch, becoming a beloved uncle figure to their children. Through it all, Thomas and Delilah remained devoted to each other and to the principles that had brought them together. The ranch continued to thrive, and their children grew into strong, honest adults who carried forward the values they had been taught. James became a lawyer, fighting for justice in the courts. Martha became a teacher, educating the next generation. Samuel took over the ranch, managing it with the same integrity his parents had shown. As they grew older, Thomas and Delilah made a habit of sitting on their porch every evening, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. They held hands like young sweethearts, and they talked about everything and nothing, their conversations as easy and comfortable as breathing. "Do you remember," Delilah said one evening in the summer of 1910, when they were both in their 50s and their hair was streaked with silver, "that first morning when I woke up in your house? I was so terrified, so certain that I would never be safe again." "I remember," Thomas said. "I remember thinking that I would do whatever it took to protect you, even though I barely knew you." "Why?" Delilah asked. "Why did you take that risk for a stranger?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I think I recognized something in you," he said finally. "A kind of strength that comes from surviving terrible things. And I think I knew even then that you were someone worth fighting for, someone worth knowing. I was not wrong." "No," Delilah agreed, squeezing his hand. "You were not wrong about any of it." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned gold and purple. The familiar landscape spread out before them like a promise kept. 3 decades had passed since that desperate night when a terrified woman had run into a stranger's yard seeking sanctuary. 3 decades of building a life together, of raising children and weathering storms and choosing each other every single day. The men who had wanted Delilah silent were long gone, their power broken, and their names remembered only as cautionary tales about the corruption that law and courage could overcome. But the woman they had tried to destroy had not just survived. She had thrived. She had found her voice and used it, first to bring criminals to justice, and then to advocate for education, for women's rights, for all the causes she believed in. And through it all, Thomas had stood beside her, never trying to quiet her or control her, but amplifying her voice and supporting her dreams. They had become partners in the truest sense, 2 people who made each other stronger and better. Their grandchildren came to visit regularly, filling the ranch house with laughter and noise. Delilah loved watching Thomas with them, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed as he taught them to ride or helped them with their schoolwork. She loved the legacy they were building together, a legacy of integrity and love that would outlast them both. In 1915, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when they first met, Delilah and Thomas celebrated their 30th anniversary with a party that brought together friends from across the state. Former colleagues from Thomas's legislative days, students Delilah had mentored, neighbors they had helped through hard times. The ranch was filled with people whose lives had been touched by their kindness and their example. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Thomas and Delilah found themselves once again on their porch, looking out at the land they had built their life upon. 30 years, Delilah said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like forever, and sometimes it feels like no time at all." "I would live it all again," Thomas said. "Every moment, good and bad, if it meant ending up here with you. Even the parts where we were being shot at," Delilah asked with a smile. "Even those," Thomas said firmly. "Though I would prefer to skip that particular excitement in any future incarnation." Delilah laughed, the sound carrying across the yard. It was a sound of pure joy, of a life fully lived and deeply appreciated. "I love you, Thomas Garrett," she said. "Thank you for telling me I could speak as loud as I wanted. Thank you for listening. Thank you for everything." "I love you, Delilah Garrett," Thomas replied. "Thank you for being brave enough to speak. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for building this life with me." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found in each other the courage to stand against injustice and the love to build something beautiful from the ashes of fear. The Wild West was fading into history around them, the frontier closing and civilization spreading across the land. But here on their ranch, surrounded by family and legacy, they had carved out something timeless. Years later, when Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71, Delilah held his hand and whispered words of love and gratitude for the life they had shared. She mourned him deeply but without bitterness, knowing that they had been blessed with more happiness than most people ever found. She lived another 5 years after his death, staying on the ranch and watching their grandchildren grow. She wrote her memoirs during those years, not focusing on the drama of the conspiracy and the trials, but on the quiet heroism of a man who had stood up for what was right when it cost him something. She wrote about love that grew from protection into partnership, about finding your voice when the world wanted you silent, about building a life based on truth and integrity. When Delilah died in her sleep on a spring morning in 1921, surrounded by family and with Thomas's old rifle mounted above the fireplace as a reminder of the strength that had saved her life, she went peacefully. Her last words were a smile and a whisper, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could build when they chose courage over fear and love over silence. And in the town of Hecla, Montana, and throughout the state, the story was told and retold of the woman who ran from men who wanted her silent, and the cowboy who told her she could speak as loud as she wanted. It became a story about justice and corruption, about bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. But most of all, it became a love story. A story about two people who found each other in the darkness and built a light that lasted for the rest of their lives and beyond. Their graves sit side by side in the small cemetery overlooking the ranch, simple headstones bearing their names and dates. But if you visit on a summer evening when the wind is just right, you might imagine you can hear voices from the past. A man's steady baritone and a woman's clear alto, talking and laughing together as the sun sets over the Montana mountains. "Speak as loud as you want here. I will always listen." Those words, exchanged in fear and offered in love, became the foundation of a life built on mutual respect and unwavering devotion. They became a promise kept through 30 years of marriage and beyond, a reminder that true love is not about possession or control, but about giving another person the freedom to be fully themselves. And in the end, that was the greatest gift Thomas and Delilah gave each other. Not just safety or security, though those mattered. Not just passion or romance, though they had both in abundance, but the gift of being truly seen and truly heard, of having someone who valued their voice and their truth above all else. It was a love that changed laws and brought down corrupt empires. But more importantly, it was a love that created a home, raised a family, and built a legacy of integrity that lasted long after both of them were gone. The Wild West faded into memory, the lawless frontier towns becoming orderly cities, the open range divided into farms and ranches. But the story endured, passed down through generations as a reminder of a time when individual courage could make a difference, when standing up for what was right mattered more than the cost. And at the heart of that story, always and forever, were two people who loved each other enough to risk everything, to fight impossible odds, and to build a life based on the simple but profound truth that everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves to speak their truth, and love is the courage to make that possible.